After studying this module, you shall be able to know the purpose and role of EIA in decision making, understand the strengths of EIA with regard to environmental management, also learn about the steps undertaken in EIA and understand these steps. Also evaluate the projects and proposals that require EIA and analyze the role of environmental management and auditing in EIA. World over, a marked change has come about in the paradigm of economic development. The requirement to balance environmental protection along with economic growth has been increasingly voiced over the years. This is in sharp contrast to the unsustainable approach to development followed in the initial phases of development that purely focused on growth without regards to sustainability. The primary focus on economic growth has led to adoption of development projects that have had detrimental effects on environment. Externalities generated from these projects, mainly environmental consequences such as water and air pollution, land degradation, erosion of forest cover, threat to biodiversity among others. All these converge to lead to a degeneration of the quality of life despite economic growth. Consequently, there has been a broadening of our understanding of what constitutes development and the need for the environmental sustainability and safety as a critical aspect of the same. Environmental impact assessment, that is EIA, is a tool evolved to incorporate environmental concerns into the process of development. EIA was introduced in the USA in the early 1970s. It has spread all over the world since then, while the methodology has been developed and adapted to various decision making at different levels in different societies. EIA has been used not only in local projects and development, but also for regional and even global issues. The growing awareness of sustainable development since the 1990s has led to evolving of analytical tools to conduct EIA. The purpose of EIA is to evaluate the environmental impact, positive or adverse, long term or short term, large scale or small scale of any proposed project. This helps to incorporate real costs and benefits of the project. EIA aids in ensuring that the project is environmentally sound. Thus, EIA includes an assessment of 1. Existing environmental status at the initiation of the project, which forms the baseline for impact analysis. 2. Various components of the ecosystem, that is air, water, land and biological factors. 3. Adverse environmental impacts of the proposed project to be started, impact on people in the neighborhood and the related externalities. Let's look at the objectives and significance. EIA is a process having the ultimate objective of providing decision makers with an indication of the likely consequences of their actions. Prior to 1970, project appraisals were based largely on cost-benefit analysis. Today, EIA is undertaken in more than 100 countries. During this period, not only the adoption of EIA, but it has also been adapted vigorously to meet requirement of specific countries and projects. Adaptations of EIA include a shift of the focus on biophysical aspects, inclusion of economic and social issues, the inclusion of environmental management plans, addressing sustainability issues like biodiversity loss and cumulative effects. The main objective of environmental impact assessment is to provide information to decision makers in relation to a new project, a program, plan or policy. Environmental impact assessment studies the potential impacts on the environment that the project is likely to cause. The specific objectives of the environmental impact assessment system are: 1. To estimate significant environmental effects of proposed projects. Its prime objective is to anticipate possible effects of the project on natural resources like soil, air, water and biological system. 2. To identify ways to avoid or reduce environmental damage. 3. To prevent negative environmental effects by requiring implementation of feasible alternatives. To disseminate information to public with respect to potential benefits and adverse effects. Now, what is the significance? The main aim of EIA is not to prevent actions with substantial environmental impacts being implemented. Rather, the aim is to provide detailed knowledge of project impacts. Many a times, various economic, social or political factors outweigh environmental factors, and therefore mitigation takes a central role in EIA. Decisions on projects where the negative environmental effects have been reduced are much easier to make and justify. The significance of EIA is: 1. It contains information in greater detail than technical reports. It is undertaken as a means to protect and improve the environmental quality of life. EIA is a process that identifies and evaluates the effect of actions, mainly human, on social and natural environment. EIA uses a multiple evaluation techniques to estimate environmental impact. 2. Environmental impact assessment uses scientific tools in an integrated, interdisciplinary manner to evaluate various phenomena and relationships as they occur in real world. 3. EIA is an important part of project planning. The findings should be considered in policy and decision making and should be reflected in final choices. Thus, it should be part of the decision making process. The findings of EIA should be focused on the significant and essential issues. It is also required to provide a sufficient explanation on why they are important and study its validity in order to facilitate a basis for policy decisions. EIA process is characterized by a number of steps dependent on the nature of the project. EIA has to be conducted in the initial phases of project analysis. The importance of an early start of the environmental impact assessment in a development project has been emphasized by many authors. The first step consists of a screening to decide if an EIA is needed, then scoping to identify the issues that need to be considered, project and environment description, and an identification of key impacts. Then comes impact prediction, evaluation and reviewing. All through the process, public participation and communication between different parties involved occurs. Now, what is the process of EIA? The first is screening. The decision to undertake EIA is based on several grounds dependent on the objective of the project. The process is to decide whether EIA will be undertaken or not. This is called screening. Screening is done to ensure that the projects with significant impact on environment should undergo environmental assessment. This is an early decision in the life cycle of the project. In many countries, screening is decided by national legislation. For example, the European Union countries have listed a series of projects that require EIA. Sweden requires EIA to be done for projects with considerable impact on environment. Screening also takes place without any legal legislation. Funding agencies sometimes require internal screening to avoid taking up of projects with adverse environmental impact. Screening is a process that could potentially lead to substantial changes in the design and implementation of the project. Screening is based either on policy decisions or prior study. In policy-based screening, certain criteria are pre-specified. The preliminary study is used for identification of possible effects. Then comes scoping. Scoping is a process for identifying environmental impacts of the project. Scoping is used to determine the nature and extent of impact assessment. This requires identification and retention of issues that are important and elimination of those that are not. When the list of the impact is very large, only the most significant impacts are selected. This process determines the limitations and the scope of the environmental degradation that occurs due to the project. Scoping generally involves interaction between the public, government and other stakeholders who assist in the identification of key areas for investigation. Scoping involves review of existing laws and regulations that are applicable to the project. EIA team comprises of specialized professional expertise of different areas related to the various aspects of the project. Thus, an EIA team might include economists, engineers, geographers, sociologists and government officials. The EIA has to be multidisciplinary exercise and calls for varied expertise to explore all aspects. The composition of the EIA team varies from country to country. Scoping actually controls the cost and time of the assessment in deciding the scope of the EIA and therefore is a very important step both in identifying the impacts and controlling the size of the EIA. A scoping process involves impact assessment and public involvement. Now, what is a baseline study? A baseline study takes account of the environment as it exists before the development project is started. This study acts as a base against which changes due to the project are considered. Baseline studies are comprehensive and cover data on all possible areas, places and people that could get impacted by a project. Scoping and baseline studies usually coincide. Baseline studies are easier to do in countries where the required technical expertise, long-term database for environmental measure is available. Thus, the baseline studies are more easily prepared in developed countries. Impact identification. The aim of this step is to identify the impact of project on different components of environment. The impact assessment comprises of identification, analysis and significance of the impacts. It estimates the adverse as well as positive impacts. The following techniques are used for impact identification. 1. Checklist. These are the factors that need to be considered while identifying the project impact. These can be simple checklists or sectoral ones. Matrices. Matrix is a grid type of table that shows the interaction between project activities on one axis and environmental characteristics on the other. Leopold matrix is an early well-known example which has 88 environmental characteristics and 100 project actions. The diagonal presents the potential impact. Impact identification results are then evaluated on the criteria of the adverse impact they have, which include environmental loss, social impact of environmental change, non-compliance with environmental standards, etc. Let's put this in the box. Box 1, example of checklist in the case of land development projects. 1. Effect on local economy, that is wealth, employment, physical impact. 2. Effect on natural environment, that is effect on wildlife, air, water and nature. 3. Effect on scenic beauty, aesthetics and cultural values. 4. Effect on services, that is drinking water, hospital care, crime control, feeling of security, transport, energy. 5th, other social impacts. For example, people, displacement and rehabilitation, other health hazards, acceptance of local of the project. Mitigation measures. Mitigation measures are taken after the impact evaluation. These measures are undertaken to avoid or reduce the intensity of the adverse impacts affecting the environment. They also include remedy or compensation measures in the cases where adverse impacts cannot be avoided. Mitigation can be carried out either by structural measures which call for a change in design or structure or location of the project, and non-structural measures which include economic incentives, institutional, legal and policy instruments. In essence, mitigation can be divided into 1. Impact avoidance, that is not undertaking the project, avoid ecologically sensitive areas or putting in place preventive measures. 2. Impact minimization, that is scaling down or reallocating project, redesigning components of project, or taking measures to manage the effects. 3. Impact compensation. This is applied as a remedy measure. This includes rehabilitation, restoration, and replacement. Assessment of alternative measures. Environmental impact evaluation requires careful considerations of the most adverse impacts and their accurate representation. This has to be done not only for the project in question but also for feasible alternatives so that a well-balanced final decision can be reached regarding the implementation of the project. Preparation of the final document. The EIA report is prepared to provide a detailed statement of the potential impacts of a project and the measures that can be taken to reduce and remedy these. It contains essential information for 1. Implementation of the project in an environmentally and socially responsible way. 2. An informed decision on the project specifying the terms and conditions. And 3rd, the public to understand the project proposal and its possible impacts on people and the environment. A successful EIA report that meets these aims will be 1. Actionable, that is a document that can be applied to achieve planning and design mechanism. 2. Decision relevant, a document that comprehensively presents the information necessary for project approval. 3. User friendly, a document that communicates the technical issues to all stakeholders in a clear manner. An EIA report has 2 parts, a detailed and a summarized part. The detailed part is the reference document which is used by technical experts of the project. It also acts as a reference for future EIA in the area or similar type of project. It contains technical information and calculations. The summarized non-technical account is a working document which is written in a layman style and can be understood easily. Main objective of this is that the non-technical decision makers must be able to comprehend and understand the findings and recommendations of the EIA team so that they can take a well-informed and correct decision promptly. Decision making. It is the process which starts after the above mentioned steps of EIA are completed. Usually, the decision makers are government or international organizations who understand the EIA process. In general, a decision maker has 3 choices. 1. Accepting one of the project alternatives. 2. Returning the EIA with a comments and request for further research in specific areas. 3. Totally rejecting the proposed project along with alternative versions. As pointed out by Ahmed and Sami in 1985, EIAs are required to aid decision making and therefore preparation and drafting of an EIA should always be carried out with this clear objective in the mind. Monitoring of project and implementation and its environmental impacts. This step is carried out while the selected project is under actual implementation. The monitoring is the process of inspection to ensure that the guidelines and recommendations of EIA are adhered to. This could be a very valuable exercise for the environmental impact assessors. The main objectives of EIA implementation are the following. 1. To ensure satisfactory implementation of the terms and conditions of project approval. 2. To verify that impacts are within predicted or permitted limits. 3. To take necessary action to control unanticipated impacts or changes. 4. To ensure that environmental benefits are maximized. And lastly, learn from experience in order to improve EIA process and practice. The main tools of EIA implementation and monitoring include 1. Surveillance and supervision. 2. Impact monitoring, that is to measure any environmental changes or degradation that could be attributed to the project. 3. Compliance monitoring, that is to ensure that the rules and regulations are being followed. 4. Environmental auditing, that is to verify the implementation of terms and conditions, the accuracy of the EIA predictions, the effectiveness of mitigation measures. 4th, ex post evaluation, to review the effectiveness and performance of the EIA process as applied to a specific project. And lastly, post-project analysis, that is to evaluate the overall results of project development and to draw lessons for the future. Let's look at the Indian experience. EIA was introduced in India in 1978-79 for river valley projects. Under the Environmental Protection Act 1986, it is presently mandatory for 29 categories of projects such as industries, thermal and nuclear power projects, mining projects, subject to an investment of rupees 50 crores and above. While all industrial projects may have some environmental impacts, not all projects may warrant elaborate assessment procedures owing to minimal impact. Thus, an initial evaluation is undertaken of the possible implications of a particular project and its location. The following projects could be candidates for a detailed EIA. Those that can significantly alter the landscape, land use pattern and lead to concentration of working and service population. Also, those which need upstream development activity, that is assured mineral and forest product supply or downstream industrial process development. Also those involving manufacture, handling and use of hazardous material. Those which are situated near ecologically sensitive areas, urban centers, hill stations, places of scientific and religious importance. Industrial areas with constituent units of various types which could cumulatively cause significant environmental damage. For an EIA, all requisite project documents are to be submitted by the project authority for scrutiny by the technical staff of the Ministry of Environment and Forest before being placed before the environmental appraisal committees. These appraisal committees consist of experts from a multitude of disciplines like environmental conservation and management, land use planning, environmental health, social scientists, rehabilitation specialists, representatives of NGOs and persons concerned with environmental issues. The appraisal committee carry out impact assessment of project based on the data furnished by the project authorities, and if necessary, site visits are also undertaken. Based on this, the committees recommend a project approval or rejection of the project, which are then processed in MOEF for approval or rejection. In case of site-specific projects such as mining, river valley, ports and harbors, etc., a two-stage clearance procedure is defined. First, a site clearance is required, followed by environmental clearance of their projects. This is to ensure that the ecologically and fragile areas are not exposed to more danger by undertaking risky projects. The process of EIA, however, does not stop here, and continuous monitoring of the project is undertaken even after approval is granted to ensure that the stipulated environmental safeguards are being observed in project implementation. This monitoring is undertaken by the 6 regional offices of the MOEF functioning at Shillong, Bhubaneswar, Chandigarh, Bangalore, Lucknow and Bhopal. The main objective of such a procedure is to ensure that the suggested safeguards are adhered to and any corrective action can be taken in the middle of the project. The monitoring procedure involves the following. 1. 6 monthly reporting by the project authorities on the progress of implementation of the stipulated safeguards. 2. Field visits by officers and expert teams from the concerned ministry or its regional offices to collect and analyze performance data of development projects. Next, in case of substantial deviations and poor or no response, the matter is taken up with the concerned state government. Similarly, changes in scope of project are identified to check whether review of earlier clearance is called for or not. Let us summarize what we have done today. EIA is a process having the ultimate objective of providing decision makers with an indication of the likely consequences of their actions. The main objective of environmental impact assessment is to provide information to decision makers in relation to a new project, a program plan or policy. Environmental impact assessment studies the potential impacts on the environment that the project is likely to cause. Many a times, various economic, social or political factors outweigh environmental factors, and therefore mitigation takes a central role in EIA. The findings of EIA should be focused on the significant and essential issues. It is also required to provide a sufficient explanation on why they are important and study its validity in order to facilitate a basis for policy decisions. The decision to undertake EIA is based on several grounds dependent on the objective of the project.